Hello, junior squirrels and any seniors who are joining us. It's that time. And let's see. Dance at Grandpa's is what we have today. Hooray! Have a good time. Oh man, I thought Pa was sitting on the bench playing his fiddle, but no, that's an old man just sitting there watching. Excuse me. Always checking to see, and I should always do this beforehand, of how long this chapter is. It's a good long one. We'll see how much Granny can read, because I still have to get to Little Women yet. Dance at Grandpa's. Monday morning, everybody got up early in a hurry to get started to Grandpa's. Pa wanted to be there to help with the work of gathering and boiling the sap. Remember, they're making the maple syrup. Ma would help Grandma and the aunts make good things to eat for all the people who were coming to the dance. I think I'll use my fancy Tracy dab rag today. Let's see. Breakfast was, I'd love to be there for all that good food, wouldn't you? Breakfast was eaten and the dishes washed and the beds made by lamplight, so I guess people stayed over since it was such a long way. Pa packed his fiddle carefully in its box and put it in a big sled that was already waiting at the gate. The air was cold and frosty and the light was gray when Laura and Mary and Ma with baby Carrie were tucked in snug and warm under the robes on the straw in the bottom of the sled. Whew, what a sentence. The horses shook their heads and pranced, making the sleigh bells ring merrily. I bet that was a pretty noise. And away they went on the road through the big woods to Grandpa's, over the river and through the woods. I don't know if there was a river, but definitely woods. The snow was damp and smooth in the road, so the sled slipped quickly over it, and the big trees seemed to be hurrying by on either side. After a while, there was sunshine in the woods, and the air sparkled. The long streaks of yellow light lay between the shadows of the tree trunks, and the snow was colored faintly pink. I don't know why I keep having a little burp wanting to come up. I've only been drinking coffee. Let's see. Sparkled, long streaks of yellow lay between the shadows of the tree trunk. Okay, pink. All the shadows were thin and blue, and every little curve of snow drifts and every little track in the snow had a shadow. Pa showed Laura the tracks of the wild creatures in the snow at the sides of the road. The small leaping tracks of cottontail rabbits, the tiny tracks of field mice, and the feather stitching tracks of snowbirds. There were larger tracks like dogs' tracks where foxes had run, and there were the tracks of a deer that had bounded away into the woods. The air was growing warmer already, and Pa said that the snow wouldn't last long. It did not seem long until they were sweeping into the clearing at Grandpa's house. All the sleigh bells jingling with all the folks coming. Grandma came to the door and stood there smiling, calling to them to come in. She said that Grandpa and Uncle George were already at work out of the maple woods, in the maple woods. So Pa went to help them, while Laura and Mary and Ma, with baby Carrie in her arms, went into Grandma's house and took off their wraps. Bet they were knitted. Laura loved Grandma's house. It was much larger than their house at home. There was one great big room, and then there was a little room that belonged to Uncle George, and there was another room for the aunts, Aunt Docia and Aunt Ruby. And then there was the kitchen with a big cook stove. It was fun to run the whole length of the big room from the large fireplace at one end all the way to Grandma's bed under the window at the other end. The floor was made of wide, thick slabs that Grandpa had hewn from the logs with his axe. The floor was smoothed all over and scrubbed clean and white, and the big bed under the window was soft with feathers. That's what they used in their beds back then, feather beds. And the days seemed very short while Laura and Mary played in the big room, and Ma helped Grandma and the aunts in the kitchen. The men had taken their dinners to the maple woods, so for dinner they did not set the table, but ate cold venison sandwiches and drank milk. But for supper, Grandma made hasty pudding, and I've heard of it, but I'm not sure what's in that. She stood by the stove, sifting the yellow cornmeal from her fingers into a kettle of boiling salted water. She stirred the water all the time with a big wooden spoon and sifted in the meal until the kettle was full of a thick, yellow, bubbling mass. Sounds like grits. Let's see. Then she set it on the back of the stove where it would cook slowly. It smelled good. The whole house smelled good with the sweet and spicy smells from the kitchen. The smell of the hickory logs burning with clear, bright flames in the fireplace, and the smell of a clove apple beside Grandma's mending basket on the table. The sunshine came in through the sparkling window panes, and everything was large and spacious and clean. I bet that cinnamon apple smelled good. At supper time, Pa and Grandpa came from the woods. Each had on his shoulders a wooden yoke that Grandpa had made. It was cut to fit around their necks in the back and hollowed out to fit over their shoulders. From each end hung a chain with a hook, and on each hook hung a big wooden bucket full of hot maple syrup. Pa and Grandpa had brought the syrup from the big kettle in the woods. They steadied the buckets with their hands, but the weight hung from the yokes on their shoulders. That's how they carried things. I bet it was kind of rough on their shoulders, though. Ooh. Grandma made room for a huge brass kettle on the stove. Pa and Grandpa poured the syrup into the brass kettle, and it was so large that it held all the syrup from 4 big buckets. That must have been some big kettle. Then Uncle George came with a smaller bucket of syrup, and everybody ate the hot, hasty pudding with maple syrup for supper. Uncle George was home from the army. He wore his blue army coat with the brass buttons, and he had bold, merry blue eyes. He was big and broad, and he walked with a swagger. Laura looked at him all the time she was eating her hasty pudding because she had heard Pa say to Ma that he was wild. George is wild since he came back from the war, Pa had said, shaking his head as if he were sorry, but it couldn't be helped. Uncle George had run away to be a drummer boy in the army when he was 14 years old. Laura had never seen a wild man before. She did not know whether she was afraid of Uncle George or not. When supper was over, Uncle George went outside the door and blew his army bugle long and loud. It made a lovely ringing sound far away through the big woods. The woods were dark and silent, and the trees stood still as though they were listening. Then from very far away, a sound came back, thin and clear and small, like a little bugle answering the big one. "Listen," Uncle George said. "Isn't that pretty?" Laura looked at him, but she did not say anything, and when Uncle George stopped blowing the bugle, she ran into the house. It was probably an echo. Ma and Grandma cleared away the dishes and washed them and swept the hearth, while Aunt Docia and Aunt Ruby made themselves pretty in their room. Laura sat on their bed and watched them comb out their long hair and part it carefully. They parted it from their foreheads to the napes of their neck, and then they parted it across from ear to ear. They braided the back hair in long braids, and then they did the braids up carefully in big knots. They had washed their hands and faces and scrubbed them well with soap at the wash basin on the bench in the kitchen. They had used store soap, but not the slimy, soft, dark brown soap that Grandma made and kept in a big jar to use for Carmen every day. Slimy soap, yuck. They fussed for a long time with their front hair, holding up the lamp and looking at their hair in the little looking glass that hung on the log wall. They brushed it so smooth on each side of the straight white part that it shone like silk in the lamplight. The little puff on each side shone too, and the ends were coiled and twisted neatly under the big knot in the back. Then they pulled on their beautiful white stockings they had knit of fine cotton thread and lacy open work patterns, and they buttoned up their best shoes. They helped each other with their corsets, and that's what they wore around their middles. At their waist. Aunt Docia pulled as hard as she could on Aunt Ruby's corset strings, and then Aunt Docia hung on to the foot of the bed while Aunt Ruby pulled on hers. They tried to make their waist look as little as they could, because that was the style back then. And oh my goodness, I'm glad it's not the style now. I don't believe I'd be able to breathe. Oh, let's see here. Let's eat all that good food. Pull, Ruby, pull, Aunt Docia said, breathless. Pull harder. So Aunt Ruby braced her feet and pulled harder. Let's see. Aunt Docia kept measuring her waist with her hands, and at last she gasped, I guess that's the best you can do. She said, Caroline says Charles could span her waist with her hands when they were married. Caroline was Laura's ma, and when she heard this, Laura felt proud. Then Aunt Ruby and Aunt Docia put on their flannel petticoats and their plain petticoats and their stiff starched white petticoats with knitted lace all around the flounces, and then they put on their beautiful dresses. They made themselves look very thin at the waist, and they had to put on all those petticoats. Aunt Docia's dress was a sprigged print, dark blue, with sprigs of red flowers and green leaves thick upon it. The basque was buttoned down the front with black buttons and looked so exactly like juicy big blackberries that Laura wanted to taste them. Aunt Ruby's dress was wine-colored calico, covered all over with a feathery pattern in lighter white wine color. It buttoned with gold-colored buttons, and every button had a little castle and a tree carved on it. Aunt Docia's pretty white collar was fastened in front with a large round cameo pin, which had a lady's head on it. My daughter, Hannah, loves cameo pins. I do too. But Aunt Ruby pinned her collar with a red rose made of sealing wax. She had made it herself on the head of a darning needle, which had a broken eye, so it couldn't be used as a needle anymore. They looked lovely, sailing over the floor so smoothly with their large round skirts. Their little waists rose up tight and slender in the middle, and their cheeks were red and their eyes bright under the wings of shining, sleek hair. Ma was beautiful, too, in her dark green delaine with the little leaves that looked like strawberries scattered over it. The skirt was ruffled and flounced and draped and trimmed with knots of dark green ribbon, and nestled at her throat was a gold pin. The pin was flat, as long and as wide as Laura's two biggest fingers, and it was carved all over and scalloped on the edges. Ma looked so rich and fine that Laura was afraid to touch her. People had begun to come, and I thought they were before with all the jingling bells, but I guess that was just their own. They were coming on foot through the snowy woods with their lanterns, and they were driving up to the door in sleds and in wagons. Sleigh bells were jingling all the time. The big room filled with tall boots and swishing skirts, and ever so many babies were lying in rows on Grandma's bed. Uncle James and Aunt Libby had come with their little girl, whose name was Laura Ingalls, too. The two Lauras leaned on the bed and looked at the babies, and the other Laura said her baby was prettier than baby Carrie. She is not either, Laura said. Carrie's the prettiest baby in the whole world. No, she isn't, the other Laura said. Yes, she is. And there are the two Lauras. Look at all those babies. Can you see them? A lot of babies I see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that I can see right there. No, she isn't. Mom came sailing over in the Find a Lane and said severely, Laura. So neither Laura said anything more. Uncle George was blowing his bugle. It made a loud, ringing sound in the big room, and Uncle George joked and laughed and danced, blowing the bugle. Then Pa took his fiddle out of his box and began to play, and all the couples stood in squares on the floor and began to dance when Pa called the figures. Grand right and left, Pa called out, and all the skirts began to swirl, and all the boots began to stamp. The circles went round and round, all the skirts going one way and all the boots going the other way, and hands clasping and parting high up in the air. Swing your partners, Pa called. Pa called, and each gent bowed to the lady on the left. They all did as Pa said. Laura watched Ma skirt swaying, and her little waist bending, and her dark head bowing, and she thought Ma was the loveliest dancer in the world. The fiddle was singing, Oh, you buffalo girls, aren't you coming out tonight, coming out tonight, coming out tonight? Buffalo gals, aren't you coming out tonight to dance by the light of the moon? The little circles and the big circles went round and round, and the skirts swirled, and the boots stamped, and the partners bowed and separated and met and bowed again. In the kitchen, Grandma was all by herself, stirring the boiling syrup in the big brass kettle. She stirred in time to the music. By the back door was a pail of clean snow, and sometimes Grandma took a spoonful of syrup from the kettle and poured it on some of the snow in a saucer. Laura watched the dancers again. Pa was playing the Irish washerwoman now, and he called, Do-si-do, ladies, do-si-do. Come down heavy on your heel and toe. Laura could not keep her feet still. Uncle George looked at her and laughed. Then he caught her by the hand and did a little dance with her in the corner. She liked Uncle George. Everybody was laughing. Over by the kitchen door, they were dragging Grandma in from the kitchen. Grandma's dress was beautiful, too. A dark blue calico with autumn-colored leaves scattered over it. Her cheeks were pink from laughing, and she was shaking her head. The wooden spoon was in her hand. I can't leave the syrup, she said, but Pa began to play the Arkansas Traveler, and everybody began to clap in time to the music, so Grandma bowed to them all and did a few steps by herself. Let me show you the picture before we turn the page. We're having a high old time. And that was pretty rare that they would have, I guess, those get-togethers back then. So when they did get together, they had a big, big time, I bet. She did a few steps by herself. She could dance as prettily as any of them. The clapping almost drowned the music of Pa's fiddle. Suddenly, Uncle George did a pigeon wing, and bowing low before Grandma, he began to jig. Grandma tossed her spoon to somebody. She put her hands on her hips and faced Uncle George, and everybody shouted. Grandma was jigging. Laura clapped her hands in time to the music with all the other clapping hands. The fiddle sang as it had never sung before. Grandma's eyes were snapping, and her cheeks were red, and underneath her skirts her heels were clicking as fast as the thumping of Uncle George's boots. Everybody was excited. Uncle George kept on jigging, and Grandma kept on facing him jigging too. The fiddle did not stop. Uncle George began to breathe loudly, and he wiped sweat off his forehead. Grandma's eyes twinkled. You can't be her, George, somebody shouted. Uncle George jigged faster. He jigged twice as fast as he had been jigging. So did Grandma. Everybody cheered again. All the women were laughing and clapping their hands, and all the men were teasing George. George didn't care, but he did not have breath enough to laugh. He was jigging. Pa's eyes were snapping and sparking, and he was standing up watching George and Grandma, and the bow danced over the fiddle strings. Laura jumped up and down and squealed and clapped her hands. Grandma kept on jigging. Her hands were on her hips and her chin was high and she was smiling. George kept on jigging, but his boots did not thump as loudly as they had thumped at first. Grandma's heels kept on clickety-clacking gaily. A drop of sweat dripped off George's forehead and shone on his cheek. All at once he threw up both arms and gasped, "I'm beat!" He stopped jigging, so Grandma beat him. Everybody made a terrific noise, shouting and yelling and stamping, cheering Grandma. Grandma jigged just a little minute more, and then she stopped. She laughed and gasped. Her eyes sparkled, just like Pa's when he laughed. George was laughing too and wiping his forehead on his sleeve. Suddenly, Grandma stopped laughing. She turned and ran as fast as she could into the kitchen. She forgot about the syrup. The fiddle had stopped playing. All the women were talking at once and all the men teasing George, but everybody was still for a minute when Grandma looked like that. Then she came to the door between the kitchen and the big room and said, "The syrup is waxing. Come and help yourselves." Then everybody began to talk and laugh again. They all hurried to the kitchen for plates and outdoors to fill the plates with snow. The kitchen door was open and the cold air came in. Outdoors, the stars were frosty in the sky and the air nipped Laura's cheeks and nose. Her breath was like smoke. She and the other Laura and all the other children scooped up clean snow with their plates. Then they went back into the crowded kitchen. Grandma stood by the brass kettle, and with the big wooden spoon, she poured hot syrup on each plate of snow. It cooled into soft candy, and as fast as it cooled, they ate it. They could eat all they wanted, for maple sugar never hurt anybody. There was plenty of syrup in the kettle and plenty of snow outdoors. As soon as they ate one plateful, they filled their plates with snow again, and Grandma poured more syrup on it. When they had eaten the soft maple candy until they could eat no